Next up in the agenda is our forest health update. The forest health highlights were published a couple of weeks ago for 2020 by the forest health specialists in the Michigan Department of Natural Resources. Today we have Simeon Wright, who is one of those specialists with the Michigan DNR based out of Sault Ste. Marie, Michigan, to give us our next presentation on the forest health updates. Simeon, whenever you're ready, you can share your screen. We'll make sure everything is good to go. Please bear with us for any technical difficulties, but I think we're going to get it worked out here.
Okay, hopefully it's going to show up here.
So far, so good, Simeon.
All right, can everyone see my first slide?
Yes, we are seeing your notes slides as well, though, Simeon.
Okay, let me see. I know okay, we did this before. How's this?
That's perfect. You hit it. You got it, buddy.
Okay, wonderful. All right, let me just move this over here, and I'm gonna, okay, yeah. So as Matt said, I'm Simeon Wright, forest health specialist with the DNR. I've been in the UP, I guess, for 3 years now, and I cover forest health issues, do monitoring, raise awareness, and address forest health threats. I work with 2 other forest health specialists in the DNR that cover the Lower Peninsula. And what I wanted to do today was cover some of the highlights in our annual Forest Health Highlights report that we do. I'll have a link to this at the end of the presentation if you want more information on the things I talk about, or information on some of the other things that I won't have time to cover this afternoon. But I think we'll go ahead and get into it here. I wanted to talk about a number of different things. First of all, some of the climate impacts that we're seeing, our aerial survey efforts, and then several defoliators that have impact in the last year. And then I'll talk about some invasive forest pests that are on the horizon. Either they have not been detected in Michigan or they aren't widespread across the UP yet. And then at the end, I'll talk a little bit about our new heterobasidian root disease detection. We've got a couple new locations to talk about there. So first of all, with the climate impacts, I think probably most of us recognize that the climate has a pretty big impact on forest health, and it's always fluctuating. And one of the things that we've seen a lot of in the last couple of years would be impacts of high water tables. And I think you can see in that upper photo, a ring of dead trees around that lake there. We see a lot of that sort of thing from the air, not just necessarily around the Great Lakes, but some of our inland lakes as well. And then areas that tend to be low and wet and have trees that are adapted to those conditions have been even wetter than they normally are, and seeing some decline in mortality in some of those locations as well. So that's been a pretty big driver, I think, in the last couple of years with forest health in general. Of course, when we have extended periods of wet weather, particularly earlier in the growing season, that really favors some of our foliar diseases. One of the things I've been seeing a lot of on spruce would be an increase in the needle diseases, resulting in a lack of needles on the lower branches in the interior. And then I'll talk about spruce budworm in a little bit, but between those 2 issues, some of the spruce are looking pretty rough. On the flip side of that, of course, when we have warm, dry weather, that may favor a variety of insect issues as well, and particularly insect defoliators that are typically an issue in the late spring, early summer time frame. When we have dry weather during that period, that really favors them. So just some things to be thinking about there as we move forward. Next, the aerial survey effort. in 2020, due to the COVID restrictions, we didn't get clearance to do aerial surveys until pretty late in the growing season. And because of that, we weren't able to get any aerial surveys done in the UP. However, the Forest Service was able to do some limited aerial surveying on the National Forest land. And so that's primarily what you're seeing on this map here for the Michigan portion. And I just wanted to point out a few things on the map. First of all, around Iron Mountain there on the Wisconsin border, there's a lot of red dots. Those primarily represent oak wilt pockets, and I'll talk a little bit more about oak wilt, but it's certainly active in that area. On the Ottawa, doesn't show up very well because there were some pretty small polygons of damage, but we had some blowdown issues with some high wind events during the summer. In the central Hiawatha there, in the central UP, the West Hiawatha, red dots represent pockets of red pine mortality. And we surveyed those locations for heterobasidian root disease that I'll talk about in a little bit. Haven't found it there, but the first step is to find those pockets of mortality, which could be caused by a number of things. Then there's also some brown polygons there that would be spruce budworm damage. And then moving east to the East Hiawatha there, again, red pine mortality pockets and spruce budworm would be the two primary things that they map. So kind of gives you an idea of at least a few of the things that were seen in the UP last summer. I wanted to mention, you can see in the lower part of your screen in the lower peninsula there, looks like a lot of damage was mapped, and that was actually primarily our gypsy moth aerial survey effort that we were able to complete. And so all the red there represents gypsy moth defoliation. We had a lot of defoliation last year, probably the most in at least a decade. And we also had in the UP some reports and observations of gypsy moth defoliation as well. You can see then the other map in the orange there in central UP, that's where some of that was occurring last year. We didn't have large areas of defoliation, but we did have some localized areas where gypsy moth defoliation did occur. So gypsy moth, the caterpillars, you know, they prefer hardwoods, particularly oaks and aspens, but when they run out of their favorite hosts, they will eat other things. They tend not to be a tree killer for oak and other hardwoods if they just defoliate a tree for a year or two. Even if we get pretty extensive defoliation, healthy trees generally recover. However, they will feed on conifers when they run out of their favorite hosts. And in the lower peninsula, we saw a lot of white pine in the understory of some of the heavily defoliated areas that was damaged by gypsy moth, and some of those trees will probably die as a result. We have seen gypsy moth defoliate spruce on rare occasions when they run out of their favorite hosts. Not super common, but it does occur. As far as what the caterpillars look like compared to other defoliators, probably forest tent caterpillar would be the most common that would maybe do some similar things. The gypsy moth is going to have those blue dots followed by the red dots, and the forest tent caterpillar is going to have some stripes there, probably the easiest way to tell them apart. As far as how to determine if you're likely to have defoliation this year, well, I have had a few reports, particularly from Luce County, of folks finding egg masses, not large numbers of egg masses. I think in the days when we used to do more chemical treatments, insecticide treatments for gypsy moth, they used to use about 300 egg masses per acre as a threshold to spray. So I don't think from the reports I've gotten and what I've seen, we're likely to have large amounts of defoliation in UP this year, but we may have some localized areas where it does occur. As far as the egg masses go, you're looking for these kind of tan fibrous masses. If they're healthy, they're probably going to be about the size of a quarter or a little larger. If they're smaller, they're probably not healthy, probably don't have as many eggs, would indicate a population that isn't likely to do as much. That lower left photo there showing an egg mass and an empty pupal case on a board, that's actually from inside a bat house in the Sault Ste. Marie area where we didn't have any defoliation and so far aren't anticipating any. But I just wanted to point out it's not uncommon to see a few egg masses here and there, maybe in some protected locations or on the side of a tree, and it doesn't necessarily indicate that there's going to be a big issue. As far as what you can do for gypsy moth, in general in our forest stands, promoting tree health and promoting forest health is probably the key thing there. Healthy trees can withstand that defoliation. In yard tree situations, we get a lot of complaints about the nuisance factor. The hairs on these caterpillars can even cause a rash on folks. So they are kind of a challenge for the weeks when they're active. And, the frass or the insect excrement is raining down. So folks do like to try and do something around the house. And the best thing to do is probably either scrape off egg masses or spray them with a horticultural oil to suffocate them. And that will eliminate a lot of gypsy moth caterpillars that would eventually hatch, because each egg mass is going to have potentially several hundred eggs in it. There is a spray, Bacillus thuringiensis or BT spray, that is very targeted to caterpillars, that is effective when sprayed early. Then folks can just collect caterpillars, particularly if they have a small tree that's being established in their yard or something like that, that they're trying to protect that would otherwise be badly damaged. The other hardwood defoliators, I have not had many reports or have not seen much else in the last year. A couple years ago, we had a fair amount of forest tent caterpillar, particularly in the east and central UP. We had a fair amount of defoliation, and this particular insect has about an 8 to 10 year cycle that we typically see, where you'll have defoliation for a couple of years and then it sort of crashes and you don't see a lot of defoliation for several years. And I think at least in the east and probably central UP, we're kind of in between outbreaks now, but I'm not as confident in the west UP, where we may not have had high populations of forest tent caterpillar as recently as we have further east. So might be something to watch for in some areas this summer, but right now not anticipating a lot. And don't currently have other defoliators of hardwoods on the horizon that I'm anticipating at this point in time. Other spruce budworm. We saw a lot of damage in some areas of the UP last summer. These photos are from, I believe, southern Marquette County. And across the UP, I think it was fairly patchy. In some areas, we had a lot of defoliation. Other areas didn't see so much. But the aerial survey specialist for the Forest Service, who's been doing this for several decades, thought that he was seeing the most defoliation that he's seen in the past 30 years. So whether or not that's true across the UP, it was certainly pretty significant in some areas. Spruce budworm typically defoliates white spruce and balsam fir in particular. But in some of the areas in Marquette County that were hit pretty hard, I had reports of hemlock defoliation as well by spruce budworm. And it can sometimes feed on a few other species of conifers in addition to the fir and spruce. So, question I've been getting a fair amount is, what's the forecast for spruce budworm this year and moving forward? And in talking with the entomologists that have been studying spruce budworm for several decades, general thought is that it's probably going to continue for a little bit. Anticipate more of those older fir and spruce possibly dying as they continue to get defoliated. We anticipate, at least in local areas, that it may continue until it runs out of that older host, and then we'll probably populations will probably crash. So historically, we've seen 10 to 15 years in an outbreak, and then 30 plus years where you don't have much defoliation. So right now, we're anticipating that in the west end of the UP, where the spruce budworm has been at high population levels for longer, probably start to decrease, and maybe a little bit more in the east UP before it finally ends the current outbreak. So Ontario has a pretty robust survey program for spruce budworm, and they do a lot of work there, and they're also seeing a similar pattern and anticipating some more heavy defoliation for a few more years. So I think for the last decade or so, we've been seeing spruce budworm. Some years have been a little bit heavier than others, and maybe we'll see that again, unfortunately, for a few more years. Going back to 2010, I have a map here of the defoliation that was mapped then, just to kind of give you an idea of where it was at that point. And some of those areas we're still seeing it, but it does seem to have moved into some other areas, Marquette County and some of the counties that don't show so much defoliation on that map in 2010. So with that, I think I'll move to a few other defoliators. Red-headed pine sawfly is something that we have periodic outbreaks of as well on red and jack pine. And in 2020, we had a fair amount of defoliation on some of the state land in northern Luce County. This is the Duck Lake Fire area where we have a lot of young jack pine that's quite vulnerable to defoliation by this insect. And I had a number of reports from other folks in the northern portion of the East UP in particular, where they were seeing sawflies and sawfly damage on pine. So, I really bring this up because it can move quite quickly and catch a person by surprise with how much defoliation can occur where it just didn't appear to be present the year before. So I definitely encourage folks to be on the watch for this. It's going to be your young jack pine and red pine. Smaller than 15 feet typically is when we'll see defoliation. And once those branches are stripped by these large colonies, like you see in the photo, that tree generally will die. It doesn't last a long time on a site, but can cause some pretty significant damage in that time frame. So this is a pest that we're going to be surveying for when the larvae start to feed this year in at least northern Luce County, and possibly could be applying a treatment this year for this pest. And we typically see outbreaks of the red-headed pine sawfly about every 10 years or so. And so just something to be on the lookout for. And then finally on the defoliators, large case bearer. And this is an issue for our tamarack. It's an exotic invasive. It's been in North America, I think, since the late 1800s. And it used to cause a lot of defoliation of tamarack, and then some parasitoids, some little biological control insects that attack the large case bearer were introduced. And for the most part, they've kept the populations of this pest fairly low. We do have outbreaks in some years. In the East UP in 2020, we saw a lot of damage by large case bear, and that's what I'm showing here. And the trees will just kind of have one cast in the early part of the growing season. They tend to reflush pretty quickly and cover up that damage. So by midsummer, most of the areas in the East UP, you would never know that they had been attacked. It can look somewhat similar to frost damage, and we have some late cold events that caused a little bit of frost damage in some areas. But if you look close at the affected branches, and hopefully you can see that in the image on the right on your screen, but the needles will be mined at the tips. I think surrounding where you've got the yellow circle there, I'm gonna see if I can increase the size there. You can see a little hole where that needle has been mined out. And then you have either the large larvae or the pupal case would be in the purple circles there. They protect themselves with mined out needles and camouflage themselves very well. And unless you look close, it's easy to confuse this with frost damage. But the issue with large case bear is that if you have heavy defoliation for multiple years in a row, it starts to stress the trees, and particularly if it's combined with other stressors, overly wet conditions, a drought, those trees will start to decline. And the concern there is that eastern larch beetle, that those conditions favor eastern larch beetle when those trees are stressed. And we've had ongoing issues with eastern larch beetle in the West UP. In the last few years, I think my reports have been maybe down more in Menominee County and in at least that part of the state. But if we're starting to get more stress on tamarack, we may see eastern larch beetle elsewhere. And I think the important thing to keep in mind there is that it moves pretty quickly once it starts. So once you see a few trees maybe at the edge of a stand that are affected, it'll move through that stand pretty quickly. Another point on both the large case bear and the eastern larch beetle is that research in Minnesota suggests that warmer, longer falls and moderate winters have favored both of these pests. And with the eastern larch beetle, they tend to be more successful in completing their life cycle and spreading more quickly when you have late falls that allow the insect to complete its maturity in the fall instead of going dormant for the winter, diapause it's called in insects, and then completing development in the spring. So it allows them to reproduce more quickly. And with the large case bear, we've seen, or at least in Minnesota, research suggests that warmer temperatures and milder winters are also favoring the eastern larch beetle to the detriment of that biological control insect that normally would keep the populations down. So if we have warmer, milder winters, shorter winters, that may actually favor these pests. And that's something that at least they have been seeing in Minnesota recently. So something to keep an eye out for there. But I want to move on to some pests that are not actually well established in the UP at this point in time. And before I get into those pests, I've talked about this before, but I think it's important to remember that these pests that are on the horizon that we don't have in the UP, they often are present for several years before they're detected. And going back to emerald ash borer and beech bark disease, those were present in Michigan a good 10 to 15 years before we ever detected them. And it's usually not the forest health specialist that first detects these pests when they are first in a state. It's usually the folks that are out in the woods quite a bit and just watching what's going on and noticing something different. So I think that, you know, one thing we can do is keep some of these pests that are on the horizon and have the potential to be a serious issue in Michigan, you know, on our minds, so that if we see possible damage, we can take a look at that and address it. And a number of these pests, if you catch them early, they can be eradicated, or at least you can reduce the amount of impact that they will have to our forests otherwise. So the first pest that I've talked about, I think refresher is good, is Asian longhorn beetle. And it's currently not known to be in Michigan, but this last summer, this past year, it was detected in South Carolina for the first time. And as they evaluated the area that was infested, they determined that it's been there at least 8 years, possibly more. And this is a pest that when you catch it early, it is one that can be eradicated. And it's been eradicated from Chicago, Toronto and Canada. They've been working on eradications in a number of locations and have been successful, particularly when it's caught early and the infestation is not yet extremely large. So it does really like maple, which is why it's a particular concern for the UP. It does like a number of other species as well. Here you can see the impact that it can have on both rural and urban landscapes. And there's a look-alike, a native pine sawyer beetle that we often see in the UP, and every year we get reports of this native insect from people that think they've found Asian longhorn beetle. And I actually love getting those reports because it means that folks are actively looking for it. But there are some differences. It does lack a white band pattern on the antenna, and it also has a white dot where the wing covers meet, just below the thorax, right at the front of those wing covers that the Asian longhorn beetle would lack. As far as what to look for, the adult is kind of elusive and only seen in late summer typically, but the other signs can be evident year-round, and particularly on maples. You know, we have native wood-boring insects, of course, that attack maple, but the Asian longhorn beetle is going to make these little depressions or divots, chew these little depressions in the bark of the tree. It's fairly distinctive from other insects that attack maple. And then there's other signs to look for: a fairly large exit hole that's round and large enough that you could stick a pencil right down inside it. It's going to do a lot of tunneling down into the wood of the tree, not just around under the bark, the way something like emerald ash borer will attack a tree. And so the tree can survive for a fairly long period of time before it actually dies as a result. And as you get more and more tunneling, the tree becomes prone to breakage. So what I would suggest is, if you've got maple in urban areas or near campgrounds that breaks up during a windstorm, if you notice a lot of insect activity on that, that's something to kind of clue in on, because that's probably where we're most likely to find it, would be where people have moved firewood. And then, you know, when trees are breaking apart, that's when it becomes perhaps a little more obvious. So I also wanted to talk about oak wilt, another invasive that is not widespread across the UP at this point. In fact, right now we only know of oak wilt in right along the border with Wisconsin from Iron County south. And it is fairly devastating to oak forests once it gets established. And it is expanding in Michigan, and is something that we spend a lot of time and money addressing and trying to protect our oak forests and the benefits that they provide for wildlife and as a species. So being aware of what to look for oak wilt is also pretty important, so that if we did get oak wilt in other areas of the UP, we would be able to address it, detect it, and address it quickly. So with oak wilt, you're looking for these pockets of mortality. So it might be a fairly healthy oak stand, but you've got an individual pocket where trees have been dying over a few years, perhaps. That's what's shown in this photo. We see oak wilt a lot along power line right-of-ways when they've been pruned in the spring and early summer time period, generally mid-April to mid-July. And that allows infection to occur if you've got oak wilt within a few miles. The symptoms that you're actually going to see would be typically an early leaf drop kind of in the middle of the summer. Some people say it looks like fall in the middle of July under an affected oak tree. That's generally at the top of the tree and work its way down and kill that red oak tree in a matter of a few weeks. Here's another photo showing that pattern. This would be a time of year perhaps when new infection hasn't started yet for the season. Maybe this would be taken in June, but you can see a long dead oak surrounded by more recently dead oaks as that pocket starts to develop. So that's just something that's good to keep in mind and be watching for anywhere we have oak stands across the UP. Exactly how serious is oak wilt? We got this photo here, and hopefully you can see a lot of dead canopies. This is an aerial photo, or dead trees in there in that stand of oak. And sometimes we get reports from people in a panic because oak wilt appears to have spread throughout a stand. In fact, about 75% of the oak wilt reports we get end up being something else. This is not oak wilt here. Typically when it's more widespread and not in individual pockets, that's going to be oak decline. I won't spend a lot of time on that today, but as oak reaches the end of its lifespan, maybe you've had drought or other issues that have occurred there. Those trees start to decline, and they can die pretty quickly when things line up. And that's different from oak wilt, and it's not something that aggressively kills healthy, vigorous trees. So just briefly, a few things to think about in managing oak wilt. First of all is prevention, and the key there is not moving infected wood from areas where oak wilt's present to areas where it isn't present. And that's how oak wilt is going to get to other areas of the UP, is probably infected firewood. And so that's the key thing there, either from the area near Wisconsin or from the lower peninsula to other areas of the UP. And then other than that, particularly in areas where oak wilt is present nearby, within a few miles or maybe present nearby, this April 15th to July 15th timeframe is a high risk period for oak wilt spread. And the insects, if you look at that upper photo in the upper corner there on the right, the insects are attracted to the fungus, the oak wilt fungus under the bark on a tree that died the previous year. They pick up the spores of the fungus, they fly to a wound. They can get to that wound within minutes of it's being created. So if a tree needs to be pruned during that time period or ends up being wounded, we strongly encourage spraying some sort of spray paint, tree wound dressing, something on that wound immediately to keep the insects from visiting it and spreading the spores of the oak wilt fungus. This is just an example of the sign that we put in our areas with oak wilt to address some of the risk of folks cutting down the oaks that have died of oak wilt and moving it to new locations. So we'll put up these signs if we're not able to get those trees addressed right away to prevent that from being moved to new locations, just because of how easily it could be spread by that means. And then finally, our oak wilt viewer. If you go to our Forest Health DNR website, you can see this viewer, and where oak wilt has been detected as dots. Doesn't mean it isn't present elsewhere, but it gives you an idea of where oak wilt is common in the state. Blue dots are where we've done treatments to eradicate oak wilt from certain locations. Orange dots are where oak wilt's been reported but hasn't been confirmed. And there's also some other background information on oak wilt and symptoms and things that you can get at this site as well. So if you want to know more about oak wilt, that's a good site to check out. You can zoom in and see where oak wilt is present in your local area. I also wanted to talk about beech leaf disease, and this is different from beech bark disease that's devastated our beech trees across much of the UP at this point. Beech leaf disease has not been detected in Michigan, but it's right on our doorstep, particularly in Ontario. And I've got a map to show you in a minute, but it's caused by this microscopic nematode, or believed to be caused by this nematode, shown on the right side of your screen there, a microscopic worm. And it's something that we're still learning a lot about. There's not been a lot of research on beech leaf disease yet. It does seem to be a particular concern in that beech trees that are resistant to beech bark disease, there's indications that those trees may still be susceptible to beech leaf disease. So it's another concern for us, and at this point, probably something just to be aware of and watch for potential symptoms. Map here shows where it's been detected. It was first detected in Northeast Ohio back in 2012, and it appears to have spread fairly quickly since that time, but it's probably a combination of rapid spread, and folks that are aware and finding it where it's been present for a few years. The purple would be the detections last year. And in Southeast Michigan, Detroit, it's been found in Ontario, probably about 12 miles from Detroit. So we've got a lot of concern down there. Fortunately, we don't have a lot of beech in Southeast Michigan, but as you can see from the map, it's been found pretty distant from other known locations. So it does create some concern that it could be something that first appears somewhere else in Michigan and not necessarily just next to Ohio or Southern Ontario. Symptoms, they start out as kind of thickened, raised areas between the leaf veins, like you see here. Early in the growing season, that'll be a darker green, and as the growing season progresses, those deep green bands will turn yellow and eventually turn brown by the end of the season. After the trees have been infected for a few years, the symptoms become more severe, and you see the stunting of leaves, puckering, distortion like we see here. And then after trees have been affected for several years, you tend to just have very sparse foliage. A lot of the buds are just aborted and don't develop. And the seedlings, the understory layer, those beech will die after a few years. And then eventually they've seen on sites that have had beech leaf disease for the longest period of time where those overstory trees will also start to die. And so, you know, at this point in time, I think it's most likely going to show up in southern Michigan first, but you just never know. It could be something that potentially could be moved on perhaps nursery stock, not that we're planting a lot of beech from other locations, but that's a potential concern. We don't know for sure how this is getting spread. It could even be that birds are picking up these microscopic worms and spreading them to new locations. So just something to be aware of there. And with that, I want to move on to heterobasidian root disease, or HRD, something else that I've been talking about for a while. In our red pine plantations that have been thinned is where we see this issue, these slowly expanding pockets of mortality like we see here. A lot of regeneration in the middle of that pocket where those trees have been dead for some time, and some off-color canopies at the edge where the trees are affected but not yet dead. HRD is spread when spores contact fresh cut stump surfaces like we see here, and then it moves down through the root systems into adjacent trees to create that pocket of mortality. The maps here show where HRD has been detected, and what I wanted to point out is in the last year we found HRD in a second location in the UP. That's southern Mackinac County, just above the bridge there where you see the red dots and the surrounding 5-mile buffer where we would think the risk of additional infection is greater. This was detected doing surveys after aerial surveys picked up pockets of red pine mortality. Then we go to those locations and see what's present on the ground. That's how we found that particular pocket of mortality. The other thing I wanted to point out is until last fall, we didn't think we had any HRD in the northern lower peninsula. And Emmett County, there's actually quite a bit of HRD that we detected on state land last fall. So we had a report from a forester of some mortality pockets, took a look, found HRD, did more surveys, kept finding it. And we need to do more surveys this year as well. And it wouldn't surprise me if there's even a bit more down there. But most of those infection pockets are quite young. So it appears maybe, you know, these stands often were thin 5 to 10 years ago. And there might be, you know, maybe just 1 or 2 dead trees in some of those pockets. And so it was probably the most recent thinning with amounts of HRD spores present in the area that we weren't aware of allowed that infection to occur. And so it does create some concern that we could have other areas in the state like that. And that's why we really want to follow up on pockets of mortality. And if HRD is present, detect it so we can protect our resource from further damage. So I forgot to mention all of the gray dots on these maps would be locations where we've done surveys and not found HRD. So obviously there's a lot of other pockets of mortality out there that are caused by other things that we would be less concerned about at this point. Also, the HRD map from Wisconsin, just pointing that out because there is at least one pocket that's known in Marinette County, not too far from the border with Menominee County there. So, I think there could be some risk across the UP, and it's something that we definitely want to have in our minds as a potential threat. And just to quickly go through what's changed with this pest that we assume is native to Michigan, why it's an issue now and hasn't been in the past. And it's all about thinning these stands of planted red pine because in that monoculture, it allows the fungus to spread. And as we thin, we get new infection occurring. Maybe in the first thinning, you get one pocket of infection, and then you thin again any other stands within a few miles, and you've got elevated amounts of spores. It's much easier. It's easier to get infection, additional infection, and that's when you start getting lots of pockets of mortality in a stand, and that's when it really starts to have an impact. And then once it's established, it's very hard to eliminate. It's essentially a disease of the site. And after harvesting that red pine, you probably have to go with a non-host. If it's a site that supports hardwood, that might be what you end up wanting to do there, because your next stand, if it's a susceptible species, is going to have a lot of mortality on that site. And then real quickly, how to identify a pocket of HRD. Again, it's these pockets of dead trees that typically when it's HRD, it's going to be something that's expanded fairly slowly with long dead trees in the center, and then trees that maybe are just having a thin canopy around the margin. And I won't spend a lot of time on the fruiting bodies unless you've actually seen it yourself in the field a few times. They're very easy to miss. They're well camouflaged, something to look for on a stump or at the base of a dead tree. But even if you don't see them, I would encourage reporting that, and we can take a closer look because it is so easy to miss. And with that, I do have contact information here. You can contact me directly, or there's the Forest Health webpage there, or the email rather, or you can contact the other Forest Health specialists. And then finally, the Forest Health highlights again that I mentioned. There's the link to the highlights if you want more information. And that's about it. So Matt, are there any questions that I can answer?
Thanks, Simeon. I don't see any questions in the chat boxes, but would you put that previous slide up with your contact information? Let's just leave that up for like 2 minutes, and I'll ask for anyone who wants to chime in with a live question. We'll just give a couple minutes to see if anyone wants to do that. I had thought of a couple questions, Simeon, but you answered them through your presentation, so that was really good stuff.
Well, good. Maybe I answered them all. Yes.
Yeah. Simeon, Warren Sahosky over here in Menominee County. We're seeing a real lot of mortality in what I call younger spruce, probably under 20 years of age. I don't know if it's budworm and it's killing these young trees. It's probably in older trees, but they can survive for a bit. Whereas there's something else going on with these young spruce. Primarily see it in the white spruce.
Okay. Is it kind of widespread, or is it just in pockets, or is there any sort of pattern to it that you have noticed?
Well, where I notice it the easiest is when I drive along County Road 577, coming down from, let's say from Vulcan down onto the Daggett Stevenson area, and maybe a little bit south. But that's where I see the most of it without really going looking for it.
Okay.
And
Yeah, I wonder if that could possibly be a combination of spruce budworm and the needle diseases. I know, that area that you're describing, I've had a fair number of reports of spruce budworm just generally in that area. The spruce needle diseases seem to have been affecting white spruce. And I think it may go back to a few years ago when we had a really cool wet summer, 2017, I think it was.
Mhm.
And we really started to see these needle diseases ramp up at that time, and they've kind of continued since then. And sometimes once you have a lot of the fungus built up, it's much easier for it to continue to infect. And I think the needle disease is going to be affecting the lower branches and the interior of the tree primarily, and then spruce budworm might be attacking the more of the tips of the branches, the upper portion of the tree. So it could be a combination of the two. I made a note of that, and I think I'll probably be out in that area this summer as well. And I can certainly try and keep an eye out for it. If you get photos, I could maybe see if more jumps to mind there, or maybe take a look at a specific site or something later this year also.
Yeah. I did take a number of pictures last summer, but I haven't gotten around to sending them to you yet. But basically all they show is a bunch of dead younger spruce trees. There's
Yeah.
no green left on them at all. Yeah.
Would it be an area that's
So,
perhaps
yeah.
much wetter than it has been in the past? That's certainly been a big issue, the overly wet conditions.
Well,
we've had.
when you mentioned going back to about 2017, that kind of correlates to what I've been seeing in the more recent years. So maybe it's something that got started there at that point, and now we're seeing it pretty widespread. Yeah.
All right. Well, yeah.
If you get down this way, look me up.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
If you get those photos downloaded, feel free to send those, and maybe we'll connect on that issue a little bit later and see if we can figure something out.
Yeah. Okay, very good. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you, Warren. Thank you very much, Simeon. Always great information and good presentation there for us too. So I also have the link to the Forest Health update or Forest Health highlights on both of the Conservation District websites for Marquette County and Alger County. So if you need that link, go there, or I can forward it to you as well, folks.